Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's CPU performance comparison. We are testing 4 different CPUs today in 3 different games. The AMD FX-8300, the AMD Ryzen 7700, the AMD Ryzen 1800X, and Intel's excellent Core i7-7700K. The clock speeds you can see on the screen, all the CPUs are running overclocked. The FX-8300 and the 2 Ryzen chips are locked at those frequencies. There's no turbo involved. The 7700K is set to a base speed of 4.7 with a max turbo of 5.0 gigahertz. We have different RAM speeds on each of these CPUs. The 2 AMD Ryzen chips are running DDR4 2400. The i7-7700K is running 3200 MHz RAM, and the FX-8300 is running DDR3 1600 MHz RAM. Please note, the reason the Ryzen chips are running 2400 MHz RAM is I do not have the updated BIOS yet from MSI that allows the RAM to run faster than that. Currently, the system will not boot on anything higher than 2400. That is a limitation of this specific motherboard with the very early pre-release BIOS that I am running. I have been informed that within the next week or 2 that will be fixed, and then it will be able to support 3200 MHz RAM as well. We are testing 3 games today: Overwatch, Fallout 4, and Hitman, the 2016 release. We are playing all 3 games at 1440p resolution on the EVGA GeForce GTX 1080 for the Win 2 brand new graphics card. Overwatch is running at epic detail, Fallout 4 is running at Ultra, and Hitman is running at Ultra. Hitman was tested with DirectX 12, the other 2 on DirectX 11. Please note NVIDIA's Shadowplay was used to record the gameplay that you are watching. Add 5% to the overall performance you'll see at the end of the video if you're not recording, but this will give you a good idea of how much performance to expect if you are streaming using NVIDIA's Shadowplay. Fraps was used for the performance numbers for Overwatch and Fallout 4, and the internal benchmark numbers for Hitman were used for the numbers you'll see at the end of this video. First up, we have the FX-8300. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, you will see real-time numbers from MSI Afterburner, a free program that you can download that gives you information on what your game and programs are doing. If you look at our CPU usage, you'll see it's remarkably high. Overwatch does a pretty good job of using lots of cores and lots of CPU processor power. Our graphics card is also completely occupied because, again, we're running at epic detail. Now, if you don't have a GTX 1080, if you have, say, a 1050 or 1060, all you really have to do to get these same performance numbers is to turn down the graphic detail settings. The CPUs will still give you this much performance, they'll just do it on a lower detail setting with less graphics card. Take a look at our real-time frame rate. This is a $99 processor that we're playing this game on right now. The FX-8300 is now available for $100. It's installed on a $60 motherboard. For $160, it's an amazing value for the money. Now, I recently did an FX-8300 build, $600 total cost, case, power supply, RAM, storage, motherboard, processor, everything. That included, by the way, a 120mm liquid cooler in that price. That's why we're overclocked to 4.5 gigahertz, completely stable. It is a very nice machine, and honestly, it runs better than I was expecting it to. But this is why I do these videos, because you just don't know how well something's going to work until you give it a try. Now let's switch to the i7-7700K and see what happens when we go from a $100 processor to a $350 processor. Take a look at our frame rate in the upper left-hand corner. It is better than it was on the FX chip. It's not double or triple the performance, however. Now, to be sure, we are running on epic detail. If you look at the GPU usage, our graphics card usage, which is currently pegged at 99%, that's why. If you want more frame rate, turn down the graphic detail. If you're a competitive Overwatch player and you want 240 frames per second or 300 frames per second, fair enough. Well, you wouldn't be running at 1440p at ultra detail. However, I believe that most players, casual players, even people who are big fans, generally are going to turn their detail up to whatever their monitor supports and make it pretty. This is completely payable. This is absolutely double the frame rate right now of most monitors. Most people have 60 Hz monitors. We're running at 120 frames per second with an 8 millisecond frame time. It's flawless, absolutely flawless. Now we are using 4 of our cores. We're just under 50% usage on our 7700K. 4 cores, 8 threads, so 50% usage means that we're using our 4 cores, but we're not really using hyperthreading. Please note, an i5 overclocked to 5 gigahertz would give you exactly the same performance. So the fact that this is an i7 versus an i5 means nothing. It's clock speed and architecture, Kaby Lake in this case. How about Ryzen? So here we are on the AMD Ryzen 7 1700 processor at a fixed 3.7 gigahertz. Now please note the R7 1700 comes out of the box with a turboed at 3.7, but it does not run that way when it's using all of its cores. It only turbos there when you're only using 1 or 2 cores. The base clock speed of 3 gigahertz will be noticeably slower. However, all Ryzen CPUs are unlocked, and a $100 motherboard is all you need with a B350 chipset in order to overclock it, and it really is simple. You go into the BIOS settings by pressing delete or F2 when your system boots, you go to the overclocking settings, you type in a 37 or 3700 depending on the motherboard, you press F10 to save your settings, you reboot, and now you're running at 3.7. I did not adjust the voltage or any other settings to overclock. Overclocking this chip was quite literally as simple as going into the BIOS. Since I have an MSI motherboard, I typed in 3700 for the clock speed, pressed F10, rebooted, and it ran perfectly. All of the game tests that you're going to see on the R7 1700 were done at complete stock settings, just setting the clock speed to a fixed 3.7 gigahertz and then the DDR4 to 2400. Now, DDR4 RAM does go much faster than that. I've got 3200 megahertz RAM in my i7, as I said at the beginning of the video. The current pre-release BIOS that I'm doing these tests on does not yet support anything over 2400. That will be fixed shortly. Ryzen absolutely supports more. In fact, the Asus Crosshair 6 motherboard already supports 3200 megahertz RAM. Unfortunately, I don't have a Crosshair. AMD sent me an MSI, and since they were nice enough to send me the processors and the motherboard, I can't complain. As they say, beggars can't be choosers. It is worth noting that my R7 1700 is running with a 240mm liquid cooler. That's also what AMD sent me. They did not, unfortunately, send me the Wraith Spire LED cooler that comes with the R7 1700. I'm trying to get one from them. I have requested it. Whether I'll get one or not, I don't know. If I do, I promise I will post updated information, updated benchmarks, let you know, does it run stable at a reasonable temperature on the included stock cooler. I think it will, I believe it will, but I don't know until I try it. So stay tuned to my channel for more information. One way or another, I will get hold of one of the Wraith Spire coolers. If for no other reason, I really want to see how well that RGB lighting, it actually has full RGB lighting. You can set it to any of 16.7 million colors. A stock cooler? That's pretty cool. All right, enough about the R7 1700. Is it worth stepping up to the 1800X? It is nearly $200 more expensive. The nice thing about the 1800X is it comes out of the box at 3.6 gigahertz base, 4.0 turbo. So it is substantially higher clocked out of the box than the R7 1700 is. However, please note, the CPUs are essentially the same thing. If you put enough cooling on them, they'll both run at 4 gigahertz, and then they'll both perform exactly the same. So if you're going to put a 240 or 280 millimeter liquid cooler with a nice case with good cooling on a good quality motherboard, frankly, I would suggest buying the R7 1700 and simply overclocking it. Now, not every 1700 is going to run at 4.0 gigahertz perfectly the way this is. You might only get 3.8 or 3.9 out of it. However, keep in mind the difference between 3.9 and 4.0 is like, what, less than 3%? It's 100 megahertz difference. You'll never notice that. So the deal, the value, is the R7 1700 for $330 with the included cooler. That's an impressive deal. Taking a look at the performance numbers in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you can see what should already be obvious. There's a lot going on the screen. This is a busy map where everything's concentrated right in the middle. We're at 130, 106, there's 140 frames per second right there. This game performs flawlessly, of course. I would sure as heck hope so on a $500 CPU and a $600 graphics card. We have over $1,000 just in CPU and graphics card here for Overwatch. Let's be honest, Overwatch does not require this much power. A $100 graphics card and a $100 CPU, frankly a $50 CPU will run this. The reason I'm running this more than anything else is I got a lot of requests to run it. This is a very popular game and people want to see how it's going to run. I don't think these results should surprise anybody. When you see the results at the end of this video, they shouldn't surprise you either. Now, the Fallout 4 and the Hitman are going to be much shorter, so we'll get to the results here in just a minute. But needless to say, this is perfect in all respects. Now let's take a look at Fallout 4 and see how well that runs. We're starting back again with the FX-8300, again all the same settings. I want you to look closer this time at our MSI Afterburner numbers because it's not the frame rate you should be watching, it's the graphics card usage you should be watching. And the reason for that is Fallout 4 is basically frame locked to 60 frames per second. The game does not run properly. The physics engine breaks. The world acts funny. If you turn VSync off, if you force it off in the drivers and you run it at 120 or 130 frames per second, nothing works right. So a better way to tell how well each CPU is doing is by how busy the graphics card is and how busy the CPU is. Those numbers mean much more in this test than they did in the other ones. Our graphics card right now is only about 50% utilized. Now that's going to vary depending upon where you're at in the game and what's going on. It just spiked up to 65% there when the explosion happened and then came right down. That's one benefit of playing with VSync on, and that's not just Fallout 4. All games, if you play with VSync on, your graphics card will run much cooler and will work far, far less. You may not have as high a frame rate, but please note, you'll have a smoother experience because there's reserves to maintain a steady frame rate even when the action gets fast and furious. Right now we're coming, look, we just hit 73%, 86%, 89%. Oh, look at that. The graphics card really spiked up, but it's gonna come back down here in a second, not to worry. There we go, we're back to 60. That's the benefit of being stuck at 60 frames per second is you get to see that the graphics card will vary in terms of usage rather than your frame rate varying. Now, I personally, when I play games with VSync on at 60 frames per second and let the graphics card usage vary rather than the frame rate. It provides a much smoother overall experience. Now, all 4 CPUs were tested in the same area fighting the same general enemies in Fallout 4. The benefit to that, being a single-player game, is it makes these results much more comparable. Certainly, they are slightly different runs. I'm looking at slightly different things. The enemies react in slightly different ways, but it's the same terrain, the same map, the same enemies, the same running. It's much more similar between each of the 4 runs than, say, Overwatch was, which is on completely different maps with different enemies and different friends, and, but that's an online game. That's very, very hard to test consistently without doing it a dozen times per run, and we're not going to do that. I'm now going to trim this here and put the 7700K test in. Take a look at our CPU usage. It is much, much lower. We are only using about 25%, 28%. We're only using 2 of our cores. The i7 is so much faster than the FX chip on a per core basis. It handles this game perfectly. Look at our GPU usage, our graphics card. Now I'm bunny hopping here, which is certainly stressing the system, and it jumped up to 80% briefly for one refresh, but we're back down to 50 to 60% here. There's 51, there's 54. Fallout 4 may not be the most optimized game ever, but it runs very, very well on modern hardware right up until it doesn't. Being an open world game, you can certainly get yourself into situations where the performance goes from great to terrible to great again without even trying very hard. We are not in a city, we're not in a populated area, and I am aware of that. That's been pointed out to me in other videos I've done. If you get into the densely populated cities, and if you get into some of the areas where there are dozens of characters around you, big, large firefights, performance is going to drop by quite a bit. At 1440p at ultra detail, none of these computers will maintain a solid 60 frames per second everywhere in Fallout 4 under all circumstances. But ultra detail is in many respects, I believe, for screenshots. High detail is for playing the game. It's smoother. Everything is just a bit smoother on high detail than ultra, no matter what hardware you throw at this. My recommendation is that you set it to high detail. Even if you have a GTX 1080, even if you have an i7 overclocked to 5 gigahertz, the game will be smoother across the busy areas at high detail than it will at ultra. And frankly, if you look at it side by side, it's very hard to tell the difference between high and ultra when you're actually doing stuff. Sure, in static screenshots, you can see a little bit of a difference, but the reality is, when you're actually playing and not watching, do you really see how sharp the grass blades are, the textures of a rock or a tree? Yeah, I guess you can, but I'm of the opinion that a smoother experience is more important than having every blade of grass be perfect, absolute photorealistic detail, but that's me, I'm old school. Now we are on the Ryzen 7-7700. Again, 3.7 gigahertz, absolute locked. There's no turbo. Everything is turned off that will cause the clock speed to vary. It is fixed at 3.7 at all times. Again, the DDR4 is 2400, and that does hurt it a little bit. Fallout 4 is one of those games where RAM speed does appear to make a small difference. I am going to do a RAM speed review video here at some point. People have been asking me for it. I hear you. I will do it. However, I want to give Ryzen a month or two to get some BIOS updates, to clean up the motherboard BIOS and the configuration and setup, and get some driver optimizations in place before I do so. Because one of the questions I want to answer is, does it make a difference in RAM speed depending upon which platform you're on? In other words, does the i7 or Ryzen benefit more or less than each other in high-speed RAM? Perhaps that one CPU cares more than the other. So what I'll do in the future when the motherboard BIOSes get a little more up to date is I'll test Ryzen with DDR4 2400, and then with DDR4 3200, and then I'll test the i7 with 2400, and again with 3200. And I'll do all of that together to basically answer, should you buy high-speed RAM, and does it matter what CPU you're on when you do so? Putting aside frame rates, performance, specs, charts, or anything else, I want to share something with you regarding a subjective experience. Objectively, we can look at charts and benchmarks and numbers to come up with the performance of the game. Since I did these relatively I did them actually a day or so apart, but since I did them back to back, I want to share with you my real world experience of playing the game, pressing the keys, moving the character, actually using the game rather than just showing you a video of it. Could I tell a difference between 3.7 gigahertz and 4.0 gigahertz in Fallout 4? A little bit, maybe. It is entirely possible that because I knew which was which, I saw more of a difference because I was looking for it. When I ran the 3.7 gigahertz setting, which you're watching right here, in the back of my mind, I'm going, I wonder how different this is going to be. Do I see a difference? I'm thinking, do I feel a difference? Does this seem different? So because I'm looking for it, you tend to find what you're looking for. It's worth noting that the AMD FX-8300 plays this amazingly well considering what that CPU really is, considering what its per core performance is, considering that it's a $99 processor. I have to admit that processor took me completely by surprise when I started testing games on it, and I'm glad that I'm including it. I wish I had done it a long time ago. I will admit to that one. I wish I had, because while it has its deficiencies and it does have places where it's not smooth, it's a deal. It's an absolute bargain for what it costs. Okay, on to the 1800X, the $500 flagship processor. Now, do I think that you should go out and buy an 1800X if gaming is anywhere near your radar screen as to what you buy a computer for? No. It is almost $200 more than the R7 1700. It's absolutely not worth it if you're just gaming or a casual computer user. Frankly, I'm not convinced it's worth it for anything, but that's neither here nor there. The 1700's the deal. You're better off buying the 1700 and throwing a nice liquid cooler on it and getting it up to 4 gigahertz than you are in buying the 1800X. Because keep in mind that out of the box, at $500, the 1800X does not come with a cooler of any kind. Even if you buy an inexpensive cooler, you're not going to get much of an overclock out of it. And even if you just set it to 4 gigahertz, well, you can do that on the 1700 if you've got a decent cooler. AMD probably doesn't want to hear me say this, but I consider the 1800X to be more of the top dog tax. It's the price you pay to be top dog in the business. You want the best processor, it costs the most. Look at what Intel did with their i7-7950X at $1,750. It is $750 more than the i7-6900K for 2 more cores. You go from 8 cores to 10 and they want another $700-ish for it? That's insane. However, that's top dog tax. You are paying a huge premium to be king on your block. If you want a little more base performance, if you don't want to worry about having to overclock as much, you can always go in the middle and get the 1700X for $399. It is a little more expensive than the 1700, but it has a 3.4 base with a 3.8 turbo. And if that alleviates your concerns with overclocking, or perhaps you just want to buy that and put it up to 3.8 or 4.0 with a good cooler, you could certainly do that as well. Most of you should just buy the 1700 and be happy. Finally, let me address the elephant in the room. Why are we running again at 1440p at ultra detail? That's because I believe actually a lot of people do that. People who go out and spend $1,000 on their graphics card and their CPU alone, who build $2,000 computers, play at these resolutions and play at these detail settings. After all, when you launch the Fallout 4 launcher, it says, we will now auto-detect your settings, and then it pops up and says, we've set your detail to auto-detail. Considering the millions of people who have bought Fallout 4, do you think the majority of them go into the settings and play around and tinker? Or do they go, oh, it says I can use Ultra. Okay, I'll do that, and they click play. That's not meant to be disparaging, it's just most people don't think about it that much. They look at it, they say, okay, it set my detail, they click play, and of course the early levels, the starting levels of Fallout 4 will play perfectly, even on mid-level machines at Ultra, and it isn't until you get midway through the game that you really start running into limitations. Well, by that point, either they play with it or they don't finish the game, or, who knows what happens. But if I set this to 1080p and medium detail, would you see a larger difference between these processors? Yes. Are you going to buy thousands of dollars worth of graphics card and CPU to play at 1080p at medium detail? No. So, does it matter? I'm of the opinion that it doesn't. Now, that's my testing methodology. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it, and I'm okay with that either way. But please note, I have thought it through. Some people have left comments in my videos saying, what are you doing? Don't you know how to test? Yes, I perfectly well know how to test. It's a conscious decision and choice to set it here. Not everybody agrees with that. Some people test it differently to show potential performance. If I set this down to low detail in 1080p, would the i7-7700K be faster? Undoubtedly. I don't doubt that for 1 second. What does that tell you? What useful information does that give you? Well, some people would argue that that means that future games would run better. That means you're future-proofed to future games 2-3 years from now that will need that extra performance. Fair enough. My argument, and I said this in the launch video for Ryzen, 2 or 3 years from now, future games are going to want 8 cores at high detail settings. I think that the 4 cores of the i7 is going to be a limitation right about the time the clock speed of the Ryzen chip is going to become a limitation. So essentially you're placing a bet. Do you believe 2 years from now the clock speed limits of Ryzen will be more or less of a limitation than the core limitations of the i7? Now, my crystal ball is fuzzy. I don't know. I believe that the cores will matter more. I could be wrong. And it will depend, of course, on what games you're playing and what's important to you. High resolution or high refresh rate. Do you want to play at 100 or 144 Hertz? I've already addressed this in another video and in many comments beneath my videos. If you have a 144 Hertz monitor, a high refresh rate monitor, no question, go buy the i7-7700K. For high refresh rate gaming, you want that 5 GHz clock speed, no question. However, if you want to play at 1440p at 60 Hz, then you want the cores more than the clock speed, and a really good graphics card such as the GTX 1080 or even the upcoming 1080 Ti. Now, I personally play at 60 Hz at 1440p, so to some extent I'm testing what I play. The reality is the majority of the market doesn't do either one of them. The vast majority of the PC gaming market plays at 1080p at 60 Hz. What does that mean? An i5-7500 with either an RX 480 or a GTX 1060 is all you need to do that on any of the current games on the market. All of these processors and this graphics card are extreme overkill for 1080p gaming. It's nice, it gives you perfection in all respects, but it's a fortune for a small overall change from what very modest mid-level hardware will do for you if you're really just playing 1080p at 60 frames per second. Anyway, enough of all that. Let's go take a look at Hitman. Now, Hitman 2016 has a built-in benchmark which we are currently running, and it's running the DirectX 12 version of that built-in benchmark. So it is very repeatable in the sense that it's exactly the same scenes and exactly the same process, but I am personally not a big fan of built-in benchmarks. Grand Theft Auto 5, for example, has a built-in benchmark, but I'm going to show you real live gameplay in that one. I think actually playing the game often will give you a different result than the benchmark will. And in fact, I did run the built-in benchmark to GTA 5 on each of these, and it is different than the actual gameplay. I don't think it's all as representative as maybe they'd like you to think. The real benefit to a built-in benchmark is it allows you to compare different processors and different graphics cards. However, it doesn't tell you whether the game itself is all that playable. And that's perhaps a distinction that I should make in more videos, which is a built-in benchmark may or may not be representative of the actual gameplay or what you can expect in the real world. However, it is a way to compare different CPUs or different graphics cards or different configurations to see whether or not a change makes a difference. When I do, for example, the RAM video where I compare DDR4 2400 to 3200 megahertz RAM and faster if I can get my hands on, 3200 is actually the fastest I have. I'll see if I can get some faster for that. A built-in benchmark would be good just to see what is the relative change between those RAM speeds, because actually playing the game has so many variables, it will wash out the handful of frames per second difference RAM speed is likely to make. So in that regard, a built-in benchmark is handy. I may actually use the GTA 5 built-in benchmark when I do the RAM speed video for that very reason. Moving on to the Ryzen CPUs, starting with the 1700. Now, I didn't really comment on the i7 all that much, simply because it plays it perfectly. That's not really in dispute. A 5 GHz Kaby Lake 7700K is not going to have an issue with Hitman. However, with a 1 GHz clock speed deficiency and an 800 MHz RAM speed deficiency and an instruction per clock cycle deficiency, because Ryzen is really equal to Broadwell E in IPC, not Kaby Lake. Kaby Lake has an instructions per clock cycle boost over Ryzen. How well is Hitman going to run? Now, if you take a look at the frame rates and the CPU usage, you might see something remarkable. First of all, the CPU usage is respectable. This game is using more than just a handful of cores. 50% usage on Ryzen is 8 cores, or rather 8 threads, because we have 16 threads. 100% usage would be 16 threads, 50% usage would be 8 threads, and 25% usage would be 4 threads. So do keep in mind that on the i7, 50% usage is 4 cores, but on the R7, the Ryzen, 25% usage is 4 cores. Just something to keep in mind when you're watching this. Now, if you look at I'm going to let this run a little bit longer because it is the new CPU. If you watch the frame rate, you'll see it start to come down when you get into the busy areas. Is the frame rate on Ryzen as good as the i7? Not really. Is it close? Yes. I'll show you the exact numbers here in just a minute. Is there a difference between the 3.7 and the 4 gigahertz? Yes. Is it worth getting excited about? No. And this is the danger when you're looking at benchmarks, is you are so worried about a number. It is very easy to go, oh, this one's 4 frames per second or 6 frames per second faster than that. Yes, but if one is 97 frames per second and the other's 104, does it really matter? I don't think so. I think that once you get beyond 60 frames a second for most, if you have a 60 hertz monitor, then it doesn't matter. As long as the game is smooth and playable at 60 plus frames per second the vast majority of the time, whether it runs 90, 120, or 150 is completely irrelevant. As I said before, if you have a high refresh rate monitor, that doesn't apply to you. But for the rest of us who only have 60 hertz monitors, then it makes no difference whatsoever. If you're still listening at this point, I want to say one last thing. It is very easy to create a 5-minute video, throw a bunch of charts up, put some music to it and say, here's a bunch of games I tested, here's the minimum, maximum, and average frame rate numbers, enjoy. And then you look at a bunch of charts and slides go by, but there's no context or information, there's no real-time information. Yeah, it's numbers, but I don't know that it means much to the average person. Unless you benchmark regularly, unless you do this sort of thing, I don't know how useful those charts are. They certainly didn't mean much to me. My interpretation of those charts has changed dramatically since I started actively benchmarking lots of different games. I've really noticed that charts can be misleading. Now, we're going to go to the charts here in a second, but keep in mind that game performance is more than just a chart. Speaking of charts, why don't we go look at some right now? Let's start with Overwatch, 1440p, epic detail. Yes, it's completely playable on all 4 CPUs. It is certainly slowest on the FX-8300. However, if you turn VSync on, it would never drop below 60 frames per second, and it would be perfect in all respects. In fact, all of the CPUs would do that. If you have a 100 Hertz 1440p monitor, the i7 and the Ryzen chips would also be perfect at 100 frames per second with averages in the 124 to 128 range. Now, in terms of overall performance, you might look at this chart and go, wait a minute, the fastest CPU in terms of averages is the i7-7700. Well, yes, it is, but again, different maps, different characters. That doesn't mean, within 5 or 10 frames a second, an Overwatch performance chart isn't going to mean much. Because unless you get exactly the same situation, it's not 100% repeatable. I do believe that there is no substantial performance difference in Overwatch at high quality graphics settings between an i7 and a Ryzen CPU. It's really all on your graphics card. Now, if you're the kind of competitive player who wants 300 frames a second, well, then you should know what you need, and this video is not really for you anyway. This video is for people who want a pretty Overwatch, especially when Diva's doing her thing. Moving on to Fallout 4, we notice something different. The FX-8300 and the Ryzen 1700 show the same lower minimum frame rates. Now, all 3 games actually did average within half a point of 60 frames per second. They were like 59.7, 59.8. That's the law of averages, but because the game's pegged at 60 frames per second, they all run at 60 frames per second. Look at the minimums. This absolutely coincides with what I felt when playing the game. Both the FX-8300 and the i7-7700 did not feel as smooth. The numbers say they were smooth, but they did not feel as smooth. Going to the 1800X at a locked 4 GHz did improve the feel of the game. So if you're playing a CPU-heavy game like Fallout 4, I definitely recommend overclocking your i7-1700 and putting liquid cooling on it if you have to get that sweet, smooth performance. However, again, note, these numbers may or may not hold in the really busy areas of the game. Where I was not busy. I would like to make a further note. The i7-7700K, without the liquid cooler, running at 4.5 gigahertz out of the box stock speed, would still likely do better than the i7-1700 at 3.7. So adding that expensive liquid cooler may or may not be necessary. Put a less expensive cooler on there and save yourself some money if you want to go the i7 route. What about Hitman? Now, if you look at the average frame rates, they're all very similar. The FX, of course, is the slowest CPU here, but for $99, what do you expect? I'm going to ignore the maximum frame rates for a minute because it only takes a couple of frames up there to throw those numbers completely out of whack. Look at the minimums. The i7-7700K is percentage-wise noticeably faster than the 1700 and the 1800X. In terms of minimum frame rates, you definitely are going to be better off with more clock speed and higher instructions per clock cycle. However, go back if you need to and watch those again. How many times did you see any of the Hitman runs actually drop below 60 frames per second? This is why games are not charts. Gameplay is not charts. I challenge you to find those minimum frame rates in those runs. It looked smooth to me on all 3 processors. I frankly think it was fine. So the charts say that the 7700K is substantially faster, 50% faster in minimum frame rates than the 1700. Was it? Go watch it again. Tell me how much difference it really was in terms of ongoing real-time live frame rates. That's why I do these videos. Speaking of videos, like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below this video. Post your comments below the video, and as always, check out the video description. Links to buy all the CPUs, links to recommended Ryzen motherboards, and links to buy all 3 of these games at Amazon, Kingwin, and G2A will all be in the video description below. If you found this helpful and useful, then by all means go down there, click away, and use those links and buy something, and I'll be greatly appreciative. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.